For the first time in years, it felt like the worst was finally over. But one morning in late April 1945, deep inside forests, a group of Soviet soldiers came across a place the Nazis had never wanted anyone to find. What was waiting behind that fence would turn out to be one of the darkest discoveries of the entire war. The Ravensbruck concentration camp was established in May 1939, about 90 kilometers north of Berlin, in a flat forested area near the town of Fürstenberg, in what is now the German state of Mecklenburg. The Nazis chose this location deliberately. It was remote enough that the outside world couldn't easily notice it, but close enough to the capital that the SS could manage it efficiently. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS who oversaw all the Nazi concentration camps, personally selected the site and supervised its early construction. The camp was built by male prisoners brought from Sachsenhausen, another camp nearby. They constructed the barracks, the walls, the administrative buildings, essentially building the prison that would soon hold tens of thousands of women. Construction finished in the spring of 1939, and the first women arrived on May 18th of that year. There were 867 of them, mostly German and Austrian women, including political prisoners, criminals under Nazi law, Jehovah's Witnesses, and women labeled asocial by the regime. That was a catch-all term the Nazis used for women they considered to be a problem: prostitutes, homeless women, those who defied social norms, or simply women who had been accused of things without any real trial. The camp's first commandant was SS Oberführer Max Kugel, who ran it from 1939 to 1942. He was replaced by Fritz Zuran, who would oversee the camp during its most brutal years, and would eventually become one of the most wanted criminals in Europe after the war. The SS female guards, called Officerherrinnen, were recruited from ordinary German women, trained at Ravensbruck itself, and then deployed across the camp system. Many of them became extraordinarily cruel. The most notorious of these was Dorothea Binz, a young woman from a nearby village who started working at Ravensbruck in 1939 at just 19 years old, and quickly developed a reputation for extreme violence against prisoners. In its early years, Ravensbruck held a few thousand women at most, but the war changed everything. As Germany invaded country after country, women from Poland, France, the Soviet Union, Belgium, the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, and beyond were swept into the camp. By the early 1940s, the prisoner population was exploding far beyond what the camp was designed to hold. And as the numbers grew, the conditions got worse in ways that are difficult to describe without feeling physically sick. But what came next is where things go from horrific to almost incomprehensible. Beginning in the summer of 1942, Nazi doctors began conducting medical experiments on prisoners at Ravensbruck. These weren't fringe actors operating in secret. They were SS physicians who had full institutional support and were connected to a broader network of human experimentation happening across the camp system. The experiments at Ravensbruck were primarily of two types: bone, muscle, and nerve experiments, and wound inspection experiments. Both were done without consent of the women, and both caused permanent damage, disability, and death. The wound infection experiments were tied to a very specific military context. Germany was fighting a war on multiple fronts, and soldiers were dying not just from bullets, but from gas gangrene, a horrific bacterial infection that could set into wounds, especially in battlefield conditions. The Nazi doctors wanted to understand how to treat it. So instead of using laboratory methods or animal testing, they decided to use the prisoners. Doctors, including Karl Gebhardt, who was Himmler's personal physician, made deliberate incisions in the legs of healthy women and then observed what happened. Some of the women died from the infections. Others survived but were left with permanent injuries, including damaged muscle tissue, infections that recurred for years, and severe scarring. The bone and muscle experiments involved the surgical removal of bones or sections of muscle, often without adequate anesthesia. Doctors wanted to test whether bones could be transplanted and whether nerves could regenerate. Women had sections of their shin bones removed entirely or had muscles cut away from their legs. The goal was partly to study these procedures for potential use on injured soldiers, and partly simply to satisfy scientific curiosity within a system that had already decided these women's lives had no value. Some of the women subjected to these procedures were as young as 16. The women who were selected for experiments were sometimes told they had been volunteered, or were given the choice between experimentation and execution, which was no real choice at all. Many of the Polish women who were subjected to experiments became known after the war as the Ravensbruck rabbits, króliki in Polish, because they had been used like laboratory animals. The camp was divided into several sections. There was the main women's camp, a smaller men's section established in 1941, and a youth camp nearby. The women in the main camp were organized into blocks, with each barrack holding far more people than it was designed for. By 1943 and 1944, conditions had deteriorated so badly that blocks designed for maybe 150 women were holding 400 or more. Sleeping in shifts became common. Sanitation was non-existent. Lice and fleas were everywhere, and typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread through the population continuously. Every morning, the prisoners were forced to stand for roll call, sometimes for hours. In the freezing winters near the lake, this alone was enough to kill people who were already weakened. Then came the work. Ravensbruck was a labor camp as much as anything else, and the women were put to work in a variety of settings. Many worked in the Siemens factory that was built right next to the camp in 1942. Siemens, the same company that still exists today, used prisoner labor to produce electrical components for the German war machine. Women worked 10-hour shifts for no pay, received minimal food, and were punished for not meeting production quotas. Others worked in the camp's own workshops producing uniforms, doing embroidery, weaving, sorting clothing taken from prisoners and deportees, or doing agricultural work in the surrounding area. The camp also ran a training program of sorts for female SS guards from other camps. So Ravensbruck functioned as a kind of hub for the brutal guard system that operated throughout occupied Europe. Punishment at Ravensbruck was administered casually and brutally. Women were beaten for minor infractions. The punishment bunker, a small cell block at the edge of the camp, held women in dark, tiny cells for days or weeks. Flogging was officially part of the disciplinary system, carried out formally in front of other prisoners as a warning. Dorothea Binz was known to administer beatings personally and seemed to enjoy it. Other guards used dogs. Some women were simply shot for attempting to escape or for reasons that weren't documented at all. Despite this, resistance existed. Women shared food. They hid sick prisoners during selections. Polish women organized secretly and maintained contact with the outside world through letters using coded language. Some women managed to hide paper and write down what was happening, smuggling testimony out of the camp in the hope that someone would eventually know the truth. By late 1944, the camp was receiving more prisoners than it could handle, because the Soviet army was pushing westward, and the Nazis were evacuating camps further east. Women from Auschwitz-Birkenau, from camps in Poland and the Baltic states, were crammed into Ravensbruck. The population swelled to somewhere between 45,000 and 50,000 women. At that point, the death rate accelerated sharply. And it was around this time that the Nazis began making decisions about the camp's future that crossed into outright mass murder, on a scale even greater than what had already been happening. They decided to build a gas chamber. This one was relatively small compared to the enormous facilities at Auschwitz-Birkenau, but it was deadly. It began operating in late January or early February 1945. Estimates suggest that between 5,000 and 6,000 women were gassed there in just a few months before the camp's liberation. The selection process for the gas chamber was conducted by SS doctors in the camp, who would examine prisoners and mark those deemed too weak to work. These women were told they were being transferred to a rest camp called Mitverda, or Uckermark. Many suspected the truth. Some tried to sabotage the selections by wearing makeup or pinching their cheeks to look healthier. Others were simply too sick to resist. The women selected were transported to the gas chamber in small groups and killed using Zyklon B, or carbon monoxide, depending on the account. At the same time, the camp was facing another crisis. The Soviet Red Army was advancing from the east at a pace that made it clear Germany was losing the war. In late January 1945, the Soviets liberated Auschwitz, and the news spread among prisoners and guards alike. Himmler began negotiating with Count Folke Bernadotte, a Swedish Red Cross official, about possibly releasing some prisoners in exchange for favorable treatment after the war. These negotiations would eventually result in the famous White Buses operation in early 1945. The White Buses, organized by the Swedish and Danish Red Cross, arrived at Ravensbruck beginning in late March 1945. Their mission was to evacuate Scandinavian prisoners, Norwegians, Danes, and Swedes, who had been arrested for resistance activities. Initially, the agreement covered only these nationalities, but eventually French, Belgian, and Polish women were included. Between late March and mid-April 1945, approximately 7,500 women were evacuated from Ravensbrück by the White Buses and transported to Sweden and Denmark. For those women, this rescue was the difference between life and death. But for the majority of prisoners still in the camp as April 1945 arrived, a different fate awaited. On April 27th and 28th, the Soviet forces just days away, the SS began forcing remaining prisoners on a death march westward. Between 20 and 25,000 women were driven out of the camp on foot, marching through the forests and roads of northern Germany with no clear destination. The guards shot those who fell behind. Many died of exhaustion, starvation, and exposure. Others managed to escape into the woods during the chaos or were liberated by Soviet or Allied forces in the following days. Commandant Fritz Sören fled the camp on April 28th with a small group of prisoners he intended to use as hostages or bargaining chips. He drove west and eventually handed over the last prisoners, including Odette Sansom, a British Special Operations executive agent who had been held at Ravensbrück, and others to American forces in an attempt to negotiate his own safety. It didn't work. He was captured, tried, and executed in 1950. Behind him, he left a camp that was still full of sick and dying women. On April 30th, 1945, the same day Adolf Hitler died by suicide in his Berlin bunker, Soviet forces of the 49th Army reached Ravensbrück. What they found was a camp on the edge of total collapse. The SS had already fled. The gas chambers had been used as recently as the last week of April, and then partially dismantled in a rushed attempt to hide evidence. Documents had been burned. The Soviets who arrived were soldiers who encountered something they were completely unprepared for, even if they had already seen terrible things in the war. Estimates suggest somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 women remained in the main camp, along with a larger number who had not yet left or had already returned from the surrounding woods. Many of the women were in critical condition. Some were so weak they couldn't stand. The Soviet soldiers provided immediate aid with what they had. They shared their rations, which, given that some of the women had been starving for months or years, actually posed a medical risk, because refeeding severely malnourished people too quickly can cause fatal complications. This phenomenon, now called refeeding syndrome, likely killed some women in the early days after liberation. Soviet medical units followed the combat troops and began setting up field hospitals and doing what they could. But the needs vastly exceeded their capacity. The local German civilian population in Fürstenberg and the surrounding area was a complicated presence. Many of them had lived within sight of the camp for years. The smoke from the crematorium had been visible from town. The smell had been unmistakable at times. The women prisoners had been marched through local streets to work details. The claim that local people had no idea what was happening inside the camp is almost impossible to accept. Yet it was widely made in the years after the war. The Soviets forced some local Germans to enter the camp and witness what was inside, a practice also used by American forces at camps like Dachau and Buchenwald in the same weeks. In the days and weeks after liberation, a more systematic effort began to understand the full scope of what had happened at Ravensbrück. It involved investigators from multiple Allied nations, journalists, and eventually war crimes prosecutors. The Nazis had tried hard to destroy evidence, but they didn't get rid of everything. Documents survived, some because they'd been hidden by prisoners. Others simply because the speed of the German collapse outpaced the SS's ability to destroy everything. Soviet investigators began documenting the camp almost immediately. They photographed the barracks, the medical facilities, the punishment bunker, and the remnants of the gas chamber. They interviewed survivors, many of whom were still at the camp or in nearby Soviet-controlled areas, and compiled testimony about what had happened there. In the summer of 1945, the Soviets conducted a formal investigation and produced a report, though this document remained largely inaccessible to Western researchers for decades due to Cold War restrictions on Soviet archives. British investigators also arrived, particularly because a number of British nationals, mostly women agents from the Special Operations Executive, the wartime spy and sabotage organization, had been held and killed at Ravensbruck. Among these were Violette Szabo, Nur Inayat Khan, Lillian Rolfe, and Denise Bloch, all of whom had been executed at the camp in early 1945. Their cases became some of the most well-documented examples of what the camp had done to specific individuals, and they helped drive British interest in prosecuting those responsible. What investigators gradually pieced together was the full scope of the camp's history. It had held somewhere between 130 and 150,000 women and girls over the 6 years of operation, drawn from over 30 countries. Somewhere between 30 and 90,000 of them had died there. After that came the Ravensbruck trials. These took place in Hamburg, Germany, and were conducted in 4 separate proceedings between December 1946 and July 1948. They were not as prominent as the Nuremberg trials, which had received enormous international media attention, but they were serious legal proceedings that resulted in significant convictions. The first Ravensbruck trial began on December 5, 1946, and concluded on February 3, 1947. 16 defendants were tried, out of which 11 were sentenced to death and executed by hanging on May 2, 1947, at Hamelin prison in Germany. Subsequent trials focused on different groups of defendants, including the doctors who had conducted medical experiments. Karl Gebhardt had already been tried and sentenced to death at the Nuremberg doctors' trial in August 1947, and he was executed in June 1948. Fritz Fischer, another doctor involved in the experiments, was sentenced to life imprisonment, but was released in 1954 as part of a broader amnesty for war criminals that many survivors found deeply upsetting. Not everyone responsible for what happened at Ravensbruck was tried. Many guards and SS personnel had fled, changed their identities, or simply were never found. Surviving Ravensbruck did not mean the suffering ended. For many of the women who walked out of that camp, the years and decades that followed were marked by poverty, illness, trauma, and a frustrating lack of recognition. The political geography of post-war Europe complicated almost everything. Polish survivors who had been arrested for activities connected to the Western-backed Polish government in exile, or who had been members of the Home Army resistance, sometimes found it difficult to get official recognition in post-war Poland. French survivors had a somewhat different experience. France took considerable pride in its resistance movement, and French women who had been deported to Ravensbrück for resistance activities were celebrated as heroines, at least in some quarters. Organizations like the Amicale de Ravensbrück were established in France relatively quickly after the war to support survivors and keep the memory alive. Germaine Tillion, a French anthropologist and resistance member who had been imprisoned at Ravensbrück and survived, became one of the most important advocates for memory and justice. She spent decades researching and writing about the camp, producing scholarly work that is still considered essential today. She lived until 2008, dying at the age of 100. For many survivors across all nationalities, the physical aftermath of the experiments and the years of malnutrition, exposure, and disease meant lives marked by chronic illness. Women who had had bones removed struggled with mobility for the rest of their lives. Those who had suffered severe infections during wound experiments dealt with recurring problems for decades, and the psychological damage was profound and largely unaddressed. The concept of psychological trauma as a medical condition requiring treatment was barely developed in 1945, and the resources simply weren't available, even if the knowledge had been. The question of compensation was a long, painful, and often humiliating process. West Germany established a reparations program in the 1950s under the Luxembourg Agreement with Israel and subsequent legislation. But survivors had to apply individually, prove their imprisonment, and navigate a bureaucratic system that many found re-traumatizing. Survivors from communist countries often couldn't access these programs at all due to Cold War barriers. Children born to prisoners at Ravensbruck faced a particularly harsh post-war reality. Some babies had been born in the camp. A small number survived infancy, which was remarkable given the conditions. Others had been conceived before imprisonment. These children, raised in the shadow of their mother's trauma, often grew up knowing very little about what their mothers had been through, because many survivors simply could not speak about it. Today, Ravensbruck stands as one of the most important memorial sites connected to women imprisoned under Nazi rule.